In this lecture, we're going to be discussing normative ethics. Basically, normative ethics is the theory of which actions are right and which actions are wrong. Last week, we discussed some topics in metaethics. Metaethics is the subfield of ethics that asks some of the deeper, more foundational questions, like what exactly is moral value to begin with, why certain things are valuable and other things are not, and how we know things are morally valuable anyway. There are two initial sort of metaethical positions that people tend to hold, which we discussed last week, divine command theory and moral relativism. And you might think, basically, that generally people have some kind of religious tendency if they were raised that way, and so often tend to think that morality is just dependent upon the existence of God, dependent on God, on how God sees things. But you might ask whether or not God exists. And if God doesn't exist, whether or not morality just kind of goes out the window, or if all of morality just becomes relative. Hopefully at this point you see that, in fact, even if God does exist, morality doesn't necessarily depend on God. And if God doesn't exist, it doesn't necessarily mean that all morality is relative. There's still a kind of foundational place for morality to exist, even if God doesn't. This brings us to what we might think of as the classical theories of ethics, the classical theories being normative theories of morality. Normative theories of morality don't ask the foundational questions. They take some of the foundational issues, like that there's moral value in the world, for granted. But then they ask questions that kind of come after those foundational questions, like what exactly it is to act morally, which of the actions that we might take are right and which of the actions are wrong, why it is that we should act morally in the first place, and what it is that's worth kind of doing. Like what's worth doing in the world? What's it good to do? How should we live our life? Finally, we also ask like what the best kinds of lives are, the lives that we should lead, and what the best kind of world is that we should try to be making. One prominent theory of normative ethics is called utilitarianism, and one of its major proponents is John Stuart Mill. Utilitarianism is a philosophical view in ethics that combines three particular ethical theses: consequentialism, hedonism, and maximalism. Consequentialism is the view that ultimately, when it comes to morality, the only thing that matters about an action, about the morality of an action, is that action's consequences. Whether that action is motivated in the right way or the agent has the right intentions or character are ultimately irrelevant to the morality of the action. The action is good if it has good consequences and bad if it has bad consequences. This leads to a theory of rightness and wrongness on the basis of goodness and badness. If an action has good consequences on the whole, then it's the morally right action to take. If an action has bad consequences on the whole, then it is the morally wrong action to take. Hedonism is the view that ultimately the good things in life are pleasurable, and that pleasure really is the ultimately good thing. Pain is bad and to be avoided. This ultimately leads to a view where happiness and pleasure are kind of the same thing, and insofar as we are attempting to promote our own and other people's happiness, we should be attempting to promote our own and other people's pleasure while avoiding pain. Finally, maximalism is the view that more happiness is better than less happiness, and that the maximum amount of happiness possible, or the maximum amount of moral value possible, ultimately creates the best world. The best world is the one with the maximum amount of morally valuable stuff, whether that be happiness or pleasure or whatever. So again, utilitarianism is the combination of these three views. Consequentialism, that says only the consequences matter, and so only the good consequences are really what matter. Hedonism, which says that what it is for something to be good is for it to be pleasurable or create pleasure, and that pleasure really is the only thing that's good. and maximalism, which says that more of a good thing is better than less of a good thing. John Stuart Mill famously proposed what he calls the greatest happiness principle as kind of the foundational principle of utilitarianism. The greatest happiness principle basically says that action types, the kind of action that you're going to take, is right insofar as it tends to promote happiness on the whole, and wrong insofar as it tends to promote the reverse of happiness. Happiness, again, for Mill, is hedonistic, which means that happiness is pleasure, and unhappiness is pain or the privation of pleasure. So if we take the greatest happiness principle and combine it with hedonism, ultimately what's being said is that actions are right insofar as they promote pleasure and the absence of pain, and wrong insofar as they promote pain and the privation of pleasure. Now, this way of thinking about happiness and goodness as related to pleasure and pain has brought about what is often called the swine objection. The swine objection goes, well, wait, if we're just supposed to bring about happiness and avoid pain, shouldn't we just all be living like pigs? I like to call this the sex, drugs, and rock and roll objection. Shouldn't we all just be out doing all the things that create the most pleasure for us rather than living in a high-end society? But on Mill's view of utilitarianism, he wants to reject this kind of objection on the basis of recognizing what he thinks of as different kinds of qualitative pleasures. That is, that he ultimately thinks that there's a difference between the quantity of pleasure that you can receive and the quality of the pleasure that you receive. Ultimately thinking that higher quality pleasure outweighs quantity pleasures of a lower sort. He thinks ultimately pleasures can be distinguished with respect to quality, and that we ought to promote quality pleasures rather than the quantity of base pleasures, ultimately thereby saving utilitarianism from the swine objection by suggesting that the happiness of pigs is ultimately not of the same quality of the happiness of, say, a human person. You might say at this point, well, how would we know that the pigs aren't having a better time than us? And ultimately, I mean, of course, we can't really talk to pigs, but Mill would say, well, look, we can determine when two things that make people happy are of higher quality, when one thing is of higher quality than the other. And to do this, he appeals to his empiricism. Empiricism is the idea that we can go out into the world empirically and determine by looking, by testing, by doing science, different scientific truths. And so here he wants to say that we can determine which kinds of pleasures are are of a higher quality. And ultimately, the way that he wants to do this is by basically taking a poll. So you take a poll of people. You take two activities, both of which produce happiness or pleasure, and you take a poll between people that have experienced both of them. And depending on the poll results, he thinks that ultimately people will rank them similarly. And if people do rank things similarly, then you'll know, right? So imagine, two things. One, eating an ice cream cone, and two, the birth of your first child, right? So take two people and take lots of people, all the people that have experienced both of those things, and poll them. Which one makes you happier, eating an ice cream cone or the birth of your first child? And the idea here is supposed to be, well, obviously the birth of your first child is going to win in happiness ranking, and so ultimately, on Mill's view, the quality of happiness that is created from certain activities is going to be better than the quality of happiness created from other activities. And so we ought to promote things that have higher quality happiness. This way of thinking also helps to justify certain kinds of pain, right? So pleasures and pains come in all kinds and at all levels. There's lots of different things that are minimally pleasurable and things that are minimally painful, but sometimes worth it. So some pains ultimately are worth suffering for eventual pleasures of a higher quality, right? So for example, going to the gym is something that is annoying, it takes time and effort, and can be painful. But the general pleasure of being healthy is of a higher quality than the minimal pain required to, go to the gym. Mill also takes a serious stance on the maximization of happiness by thinking that ultimately it's no particular individual's happiness that matters. It's ultimately the happiness of the whole group. And so when we act, we need to maximize everyone's happiness and minimize everyone's unhappiness as much as possible. This involves also when you try to decide to act in one way or another, you shouldn't act in a self-interested way if you can instead act in a selfless way that will maximize more happiness out in the world. So your own happiness, it should matter, but it only matters as much as everyone else's happiness. And you shouldn't do something that will make yourself happy if it makes a lot of other people unhappy. If instead you can just make yourself, like a little bit unhappy, but make a lot of other people much more happy. Mill was also a kind of egalitarian when it came to understanding happiness and pleasure. Ultimately, he thought human pleasure itself isn't the only thing that matters. All sentient creatures that can feel pain and pleasure ought to be considered when it comes to our attempt to maximize happiness. We ought to take their consideration, we ought to take their happiness into consideration. And so on the whole, when trying to maximize happiness, we should be thinking of humans and high quality happiness, as well as, dogs and cattle, and, even any small creatures that actually have central nervous systems and can feel pain and pleasure. So the general idea of utilitarianism as a normative ethical theory is basically just that actions are right when they tend to make people happy on the whole, and wrong when they tend to make people unhappy, which means that ultimately what you ought to do morally is take the action that makes the most people the most happy, and what you ought not to do morally is take any action that makes people more unhappy than they would have been otherwise, right, if you hadn't taken the action or took some other action. On this view, ultimately, it's not just people's happiness also that matters, but any and every sentient creature that exists on Earth at that time. And so creatures that can feel pain or pleasure ought to be taken into account. Morality, then, is based on this view on the very basic fact that pleasure is good and pain is bad, and everything kind of follows from that. Utilitarianism then offers us a sort of explanation when we ask questions like, why is blank particular action wrong or right? According to utilitarianism, we might think something like murder is wrong because it harms people, which causes pain. It makes loved ones sad, and it takes away possible pleasures from the individual that was murdered. Theft makes a victim of those that were stolen from, and it makes the victim and the victims those close to the victim unhappy. Lying causes distrust and leads to less cooperation amongst individuals, which generally leads to less happiness. But you might think, wait a minute, these things don't always lead to less happiness on the whole. What about victimless crimes, like white lies, say, to your wife or girlfriend when she asks whether or not a particular item of clothing makes her look good? Or what about particular bad actions that one might take that ultimately lead to more happiness on the whole, right? Like imagine you try to poison your boss because you hate him, and you accidentally give him a life-saving drug that stops him from having a heart attack, which leads to generally more happiness on the whole for him, his family, and those around him. In that situation, your attempt to poison him would have led to more happiness, and on this view, would be ultimately the right thing to do. This leads us to a distinction between two different sorts of utilitarianism. On the one hand, we have direct utilitarianism, or act utilitarianism is sometimes what it's called, where we often try to focus on making the most people the most happy no matter what action we take. On the other hand, we have indirect utilitarianism, or rule utilitarianism, where we tend to try to make the most people happy by following particular sets of rules that generally, when followed, make people happy. Now, on this view, sort of what distinguishes these two is different answers to the question that follows from the general utilitarian principle. This principle is that we should make the most people as happy as possible. But the question comes, how can we do that? Can we do that by any means necessary, or are there certain restrictions? Are there certain actions that we can't take when making people happy? Direct utilitarianism is basically the idea that an action is right if and only if it maximizes happiness, at least as much as any other action that could possibly be taken. So in this case, the right action is the only action that makes the most people the most happy. On the direct utilitarian or act utilitarian view, the best possible world that we could possibly live in would be the world with the most happiness. And so what's morally right to do is to try your best to create that world, to cause us to live in the world with the most possible happiness. Direct utilitarianism basically creates a two-part division between actions into right actions and wrong actions. There's no in-between. This view is in a way extremely morally demanding. It says that doing what is the best is the same thing as doing what is right, and doing anything else is wrong. Ultimately, that means that any action that you take that doesn't maximize happiness as possible is ultimately a morally wrong action. The only morally right thing to do in every possible situation is to try and make the most people the most happy. On the other hand is the view of indirect utilitarianism, which says that ultimately morality does not depend solely on the consequences, but on the consequences as they are produced. Ultimately, this idea is that morality flows from a certain set of decision procedures. We need to make decisions in particular ways in order to do the right thing, and depending on how that works, morality kind of exists insofar as the decisions that we make tend to make the most happiness available. On this view, there's two levels for moral decision making. The first level is basically just your ordinary moral principles. And these are the principles that you're supposed to follow in your day-to-day life. Things like respect others, don't murder, don't steal, don't imprison people, don't harm generally when you can avoid it. These first-order moral principles are just the kind of everyday moral rules that we all know, right? They're like the commandments, or the things that we should do and that we shouldn't do that you're taught in elementary school. These principles are, it is thought, beholden to a higher order principle, something like the greatest happiness principle. The greatest happiness principle is a fundamental principle at a higher level that helps us determine which first order principles, which everyday principles, we ought to follow and which ones are more important than others. The greatest happiness principle says act in ways that tend to produce the most happiness and avoid acting in ways that tend to produce the reverse of happiness. And everyday moral rules are the important ones, are the ones that fit that general happiness principle, right? So murdering people is something that tends to not produce happiness, and so you ought to avoid it. Respecting people is something that does tend to produce happiness, and so it's something that you should do. On the indirect view, then, what happens is ultimately we need to test our everyday moral principles against the utilitarian general principle in order to determine what it is that we should do on a day-to-day basis. On the indirect utilitarian line, there's ultimately a three-part division of action types. There are those actions that are moral. The moral actions are the ones that fit with the rule, right? So there's a rule that you have determined, like don't murder people. You've determined that that rule is a good rule on the basis of the fact that it complies with the general rule, like the greatest happiness principle, that says actions that tend to promote happiness are good and ones you should take, and actions that tend to promote the reverse of happiness are bad and ones that you shouldn't take. So moral actions are ones that fit with the rule, and the rule fits with the general utilitarian principle. Immoral actions are actions that don't fit with the rule, right? So if you go about disrespecting people, that doesn't fit with the rule that says that you should respect people, and the rule that says you respect people fits with the moral principle. There are also, though, non-moral act types on the view of indirect utilitarianism. Why is that? Well, that's because there's going to be certain kinds of actions that simply don't tend to produce happiness, nor do they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. Think brushing your teeth. Brushing your teeth is something that, maybe if you do it for a long period of time, over the long haul, it will produce happiness because you won't have bad teeth or something like that. However, in the particular moment, there seems nothing moral to brushing your teeth or not brushing your teeth, right? The idea here being that whether or not you brush your teeth in a particular situation doesn't have anything to do with producing more or less happiness on the whole. So there are going to be certain actions that are, of course, moral, some actions that are, of course, immoral, and then all of the normal everyday actions that just don't matter. The question then arises whether or not one form of utilitarianism is more plausible than another. Direct utilitarianism is rather demanding, and so this question arises whether or not morality is so demanding. Think back to our discussion of abortion. Thompson's view was that ultimately morality is not so demanding. Morality requires certain things of us, but it doesn't require that we go above and beyond and make as many people as most happy as possible. But according to direct utilitarianism, ultimately, if you're not making the most people the most happy, you are doing something morally wrong. However, moving from direct utilitarianism to indirect utilitarianism doesn't solve all of the issues. Indirect utilitarianism has its own set of problems. For example, is it really always the case that we need to follow our everyday moral rules when sometimes we see that our everyday moral rules lead to situations that don't create the most happiness? We don't want to be rule followers that, in order to follow the rules, have to sacrifice the greater good of the most happiness for all. That was kind of the basic point of utilitarianism in the first place. Here's an example of how you might get a problem for indirect utilitarianism off the ground. Remember, hedonism is the view that pleasure is the most basic human good, and so pleasure is the thing that we ought to be promoting wherever we can. The hedonic principle of action basically just says, when it comes to trying to do anything, when it comes to motivating you and what you should do morally speaking, you should always be trying to promote pleasure. You should be trying to create pleasure and bring more pleasure into the world. According to hedonism, the best world is the world with the most pleasure. The greatest happiness principle says that a right action is one that tends to promote happiness, while a wrong action is one that tends to promote the reverse of happiness. However, might certain kinds of actions tend to promote happiness but fail to do so in some cases, and vice versa? Certain actions that tend to promote the reverse of happiness actually produce happiness in some cases? If so, indirect utilitarianism is ultimately going to be in conflict with its underlying principle, hedonism. Here's an example. Imagine you are staying at home and your roommate orders a large amount of pizza right after smoking a large amount of marijuana. While the pizza is being delivered, your roommate happens to fall asleep. Once the pizza is delivered, it's already been paid for, you see that your roommate is asleep and that the pizza is going to go to waste. Now, you have this option. You can take the pizza to your neighbors who have lots of children and they don't always get to eat pizza and they're probably hungry. That would create the most happiness in that situation. However, it would also involve stealing a bunch of pizza from your roommate. Generally, the indirect utilitarian line is to follow the rule that says don't steal from your roommate, right? But the act utilitarian line would say, no, produce the most happiness possible, create the most pleasure possible. Hedonism says to promote pleasure, and promoting pleasure in this situation is going to be involved in giving your neighbors these hot pizzas. So it seems like we have a problem here, but the question then is whether or not this is sufficient reason to reject indirect utilitarianism in favor of direct utilitarianism. On one view, there seems to be an internal conflict, and on the other view, it seems that morality is extremely demanding.